Good afternoon and welcome to Webinar Wednesday with the IPDAY training team. Today, we have a lot of exciting information to share with you as we explore our roadmap for adult educators on how to transition to learning online. My name is Maria Gutierrez, and I am an administrator with Miami-Dade County Public Schools. But before we get started, let's go over a few housekeeping rules. Whoops. Remember, if you have a question, you may type it into the Q&A option and hit the send button. All attending microphones will be muted and you'll be in listen-only mode. Now, today's presentation is being recorded, so it will be available for access within 48 hours on our IPDAY website. Now, today we will explore essential terms and instructional models for adult education students, all related to learning online. You will prepare to identify the model or models that best fit your program, your teachers, and your students in order to seamlessly transition to online teaching utilizing effective technology and remote teaching pedagogy. We will explore a roadmap to transitioning to online instruction. And we're also going to revisit multiple resources that we at IPDAY have provided in 5 previous webinars. I will show you how to integrate key content from these trainings as you create engaging online classes that incorporate learning experiences specifically designed for learning online. And finally, we will focus on teacher presence and ways in which you can use technology to enhance it. Now, let's set the tone for this training by taking a look at a quote by George Couros. George is an innovative teaching, learning, and leadership consultant and speaker, and he's actually the author of The Innovator's Mindset. The quote reads, "Technology will not replace great teachers, but technology in the hands of great teachers can be transformational." And this is how we will approach today's training. You don't need to feel threatened by technology. Be an innovator. Like classroom teachers, online teachers act as guides and mentors and can be a great inspiration to their online students. This is a role that cannot be replaced by technology of any kind, but you do need to select the technological options that fit the needs of your school, your programs, your instructional staff, and most importantly, your students. Now, before we look at the objectives for the training, let's look at this diagram of key terms associated with learning online. Keep in mind that the terms online learning, virtual learning, e-learning, distance learning, and blended learning are unique. Each refers to the act of using technology in learning, but how students engage in that process is slightly different. Now, in this training, we're going to follow the basic objectives of first, identifying the characteristics of online learning, virtual learning, e-learning, distance learning, and blended learning. Then we're going to explore and list considerations for planning online resources and incorporating learning online in the classroom. And then finally, I'm going to guide you in using IPDAY resources and best practices from 5 previously aired IPDAY webinars to select an approach for learning online that best fits your school. Now, for easy reference, content from the 5 previous trainings that I just mentioned will be incorporated into today's training. I will refer to them throughout as they apply. However, if you want all of the resources shared in those trainings, be sure to take the time to view them on your own. They're all on our IPDAY website. Now, there are 4 parts to this training. In part 1, we will define learning online in a way that kind of allows us to grasp its intent so that we can easily make the transition. In part 2, we will look at basic components for creating this roadmap. Now, these components consist of best practices and resources from the previous IPDAY trainings that we will be incorporating into our roadmap for effectively transitioning to virtual instruction. We're also going to combine these components and create this roadmap for making the transition to learning online. In part 3, we're going to look at how you can transform rather than convert from face-to-face to online learning. This is actually a very interesting section because most teachers I spoke with at the onset of this pandemic who were like struggling with a rush to move to online instruction, and I asked, hey, how could you convert their classroom course content to online? So it's not really that about converting, it's about transforming. And finally, in part 4, we will look at ways in which you can establish a strong presence in your online classroom. I love that part, that's my favorite. Okay, at the opening of this training, I told you, or I introduced the terms online learning, distance learning, blended learning, e-learning, and virtual learning. So let's begin by taking a deeper look into each of these terms. You know, what does each really mean? What are the similarities and the differences among them? We kind of looked at these terms earlier, right? And they all have one thing in common. They all refer to the act of using technology in learning. And what I want to emphasize is the different ways in which students engage in this process of using that technology. Again, I want you to have an overall understanding of the basic differences and similarities. It's not essential for you to memorize the exact definition for each of these terms. You know, as a matter of fact, you will note as you begin to pay closer attention when you hear these terms in conversation that most people use them interchangeably. Now, as we look at this slide, the goal is to combine like terms and focus on the basics in order to develop a working application of these online learning terms. Differentiating between all the types of learning might seem complicated at first. You have bulleted details here to explain each type of learning, okay? Remember, I just want to provide you with a simple, understandable description of each. The key to understanding their differences is viewing them as characteristics of the learning process, which often overlap. These different types of learning work much in the way that a Venn diagram does. So, for example, what's the difference between online and distance learning? Well, the key difference is geography. Students can be together with an instructor and use online learning, but distance learning implies that students and instructor are separated. You know, nowadays, however, most distance learning courses are offered via online portals. So actually the two terms are kind of synonymous. Online learning is engaging in learning through the internet on any type of device in real time or through recorded or written information, right? E-learning simply describes that there are electronic aspects involved in the learning process, such as the use of technology. The term distance learning refers to the geographical aspect of learning, right? Any type of learning that's done from a place that is not at the same location as the instructor is considered distance learning. Blended learning refers to educational methods in which both the physical class time and electronic learning take place. So it's also e-learning because of its electronic component. Online learning is always a type of e-learning, right? Because of the electronic device used to deliver information, and it's a form of distance learning because it's done without physically attending the class. Online learning can also be mobile learning, right? If the educational content and the activities are delivered via mobile devices such as smartphones. So you see how it's all kind of overlapping. Now, before moving on to the next section, I want you to remember that when you are planning online resources and incorporating learning online, you've got to consider multiple factors such as the course objectives, intended course student outcomes, student needs, and student access to technology, and student digital literacy. Only then will you be able to determine which approach best fits the needs and goals of your students. And also keep in mind that the success of your online courses depends a lot on the teaching environment. Teaching methods play a key role in the selection of the appropriate design. The decision between one type or the other depends a lot on your students' learning styles, right? And willingness to travel. Well, we quickly arrived at part 2 of this training. Now, this part is definitely a little intense because I want to be sure to bring together all of the resources and best practices that you need to include as you develop this roadmap to transitioning online. So take a deep breath and let's get started. All right. As I indicated in the introduction, we will be referring to resources and best practices that were introduced and explained in depth in these 5 IPDE webinars. Let me just go over the bulleted content under each webinar title that we're including, just so that it's easier for you to have it all outlined on one slide, right? Okay, stay with me. Even if you haven't viewed all these prior trainings, I will be going over this bulleted content today. And as you probably figured out by reading the titles above, you can see that these 5 trainings are all about one thing: successful online teaching and learning. It's essential for you to be able to put all of this highlighted information together as you develop your roadmap. In other words, just kind of think of the 5 trainings as puzzle pieces that you're going to fit together to build the road to transitioning to learning online. As we build the sections of road, so to speak, I will include visuals from these webinar trainings so that you can easily identify and locate the specific content that we will be incorporating from each. Look at webinar number 1, using the IISPs in a virtual setting. Remember that one? As far as resources go, you know we will be using the IISPs for tape reading, language, and math, along with the common planning tools for tape reading, language, and math for the multi-level ABE classrooms. In the bottom half of the chart, you can see that we will be applying 2 best practices addressed in this webinar. These include creating a digital scope and sequence using these IISPs and holding virtual data chats, also using these IISPs. Now let's move to webinar 2. We'll be using the chart on discussion points for creating a virtual orientation course, the template for the virtual course syllabus, and the provided online course evaluation rubric. All of these components will be used together to identify which virtual components you will include as you transition to this learning online. From webinar number 3, we will use the listed active learning techniques, generate, integrate, and retrieve, and the 3 types of interactions that support active learning: the student to teacher, student to student, and student to content interaction. We will develop activities that will take all of these components into consideration to ensure maximum student engagement and participation. In webinar 4, we addressed instructional rigor online. From this webinar, we will use the adapted DOK wheel, right, with the online resources. We're also going to use the DOK lesson planning guide, the IISPs, the common planning tools for the multi-level ABE classrooms, and the provided formula for academic rigor. We're going to use all of these resources to actually apply this formula and ensure that our online lessons are rigorous, challenging, and motivating to our students. Finally, webinar number 5 emphasized the online monitoring piece, just to ensure that we continuously evaluate our online program or programs with the intent of providing any necessary support or intervention, as well as make changes that will support continued improvement. Okay, folks, take a deep breath. I want you to relax. You have seen all of this before, and even if you haven't, again, I'm going to break it down even further. What's important here is that you are able to put all of these components together by the end of this webinar, and that you're able to create your own roadmap. Don't worry, I'm leading you there. We're going to make this happen. Now, we already took a look at the resources and best practices that we're going to use to develop this roadmap, but we need to categorize them and put them in order so that we're headed in the right direction. Otherwise, we're going to get lost. Let's take a look at the navigation points on this slide. 1, we will begin with general considerations. Some of these include technology requirements, student enrollment, assessment and placement, and internet safety. We continue with some considerations for course setup at number 2. These include course location, modality, the instructional program, and a communication plan. At number 3, you're going to look at what your overall course components look like. What's the LMS platform, the synchronous and asynchronous components, additional online accounts, or the concurrent communication plan. At number 4, you're going to ask, okay, so how will I access or gain access to the virtual course? How will students gain access? Okay, you're going to look at the registration process, initial virtual course access, And you're going to consider strongly having a virtual orientation course. In number 5, we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty, right, as we address course content and the instructional delivery. We're going to look at content such as scope and sequence, the syllabus with activities and due dates, an instructional framework, the instructional strategies you'll be using, classroom processes, and differentiating and individualizing instruction. At number 6, we have additional support and resources. Here we're going to look at planning resources, ongoing technical and academic support, instructional and activities resources. Number 7 addresses student assessment and student progress. So you have to consider assessment tools, your IISPs, and student data chats. And finally, you're going to address course monitoring and improvement, right? So you'll be monitoring courses virtually, gauging student progress, identifying areas for improvement, and then providing instructional support through coaching. I know that I just went through a lot of information, but again, don't stress. We're going to look at each one of these steps in greater detail. Plus, I'm going to tie in the resources and the best practices that we addressed on the previous slide to each of these corresponding steps. Now, let's briefly look at the layout for this slide, because all the slides addressing the 8 navigation points along our roadmap are laid out in the same manner for consistency. First of all, each navigation point is listed at the top left. Next to it, you have 3 pieces of information. There's a webinar reference. Refer to the listed webinar or webinars if you want additional information on the content presented for this section. Remember, all of these webinars and corresponding resources are available on the IFDE website. Next, if you have the resources from the listed webinar that you are encouraged to use as you develop this section of your roadmap. In this instance, for example, you will benefit from using the chart titled Discussion Points for VSO Orientation in order to identify some general considerations as you start on your roadmap. The best practice is a suggestion on how to incorporate or use the identified resource. Now, let's look at this first consideration. Technology requirements. As you begin to create your roadmap to learning online, you first need to identify the technology requirements. For example, will students be using a laptop or desktop for the LMS web application? What about a cell phone with a cell app? Will the school be providing tablets? All of these questions you have to answer. So you're going to do the same with the software requirements. What LMS platform do you plan to use? Will there be any computer assisted instructional programs or CAI in addition to the main platform? Will students need to use Canvas as well as Zoom? Will you be supporting instruction with an additional LMS platform such as TABE Academy? Will students be using virtual workbooks? You know, these are all questions to consider and to answer. Next, you have student enrollment. What is the enrollment process going to look like for your virtual course? How will students register for the course? Will it be online? What payment methods will be acceptable? Try to streamline the process as much as possible. You know, you may even want to create a cheat note with a simple flow chart of the registration or enrollment process and just kind of have it there for the students. Let's talk about assessment and placement. You're going to need to address how you plan to assess students initially and how you plan to place them. This may seem a little foolish at first, but remember that just last year when we were forced to suddenly transition to online instruction, you know, we lost the ability to test our AGE students because neither CASAS nor TABE, 2 primary ones that we use, were available for distance online application, right? So you also need to address how students will be placed in the most appropriate functional level. This is important because you will need to communicate this information to students as they register for the appropriate virtual course. Finally, let's talk about internet safety. You have got to include your district's internet policy use. Be sure that all students understand the do's and don'ts of internet use and ensure a safe online environment where all your students are comfortable attending their online courses, participating in shared activity, and just interacting with instructors and with each other. Okay, let's continue with 2 considerations for course setup. We begin with course location. First of all, What will be your virtual online course location? Will your course be 100% online, or will it be a blended model where students participate in both face-to-face and virtual instruction? You've got to make that determination. What about course modality? This refers to the synchronous and asynchronous instructional components. So just to refresh your memory, remember synchronous learning is the online or distance learning that happens in real time. It's not as flexible as asynchronous learning because it happens within a set class schedule and has a required login time, right? Now, asynchronous is a little bit more flexible, so students can complete their work at their convenience. Now, this being said, it's easy to see that a combination of both would provide students with the greatest amount of flexibility and learning opportunities. So here, you need to specifically identify what synchronous components and asynchronous components you will include in your online course. Now, try to keep it as simple as possible in the beginning. Start with a minimal number of components and then add as you and your students become more proficient in the virtual realm. Let's move to the instructional platform. You have got to be sure to select the right LMS platform for you. Do a little research. See which platform includes the components that you selected. Is it Canvas? Is it Zoom? What I really want to emphasize here is that you must also select a Plan B option. Don't stick to just one option because I guarantee that this option will fail at some point. When this happens, you want to be sure that you can transition instruction to another platform or method of communication, right? This is so critical, and it's going to avoid a great deal of anxiety on your part as well as your students' part. Finally, let's talk about the communication plan. Yes, you do have to address how you're going to communicate with your students. The more options you have, the better. Communicate these options to your student and kind of be sure that they have the right apps. Also, be sure to use various methods of communication. You want your students also to be comfortable with the selected methods, and remember, practice makes perfect. Now, let's look at overall course components and see what this is supposed to look like. Let's think about the LMS platform. Which primary platform are you going to select, right? What's going to be your Plan B? When we're talking about your synchronous and your asynchronous components, right? You have to be specific about which tools you're going to use, right? So I want to bring something to your attention. Let's say that, for example, you are thinking about, okay, so I know that I want to use assignments and I want to use quizzes. I want to incorporate gradebook. You need to be able to make that determination ahead of time, right? And you need to decide which of these items are going to be non-negotiables and have to be included in every virtual course. Remember, you must discuss all the options with your team, right, in order to make the best decision for your team. Let's move on to access to the virtual course and how you're going to provide this. All right, back to registration. What are your registration procedures? How are students going to register for virtual courses? It seems a little bit redundant, but think about it. What documentation is required? Do students know this? They're not physically present in the building, so how are they going to access this information? What is the cost and how are they going to pay for the courses? Will the process be entirely online? Are they going to have to complete part of the process online or part of it face-to-face? You need to answer all these questions and then determine the best way to set up student registration for your virtual classes at your site. Now, another thing regarding registration or directly tied to it is going to be the initial virtual course access. All right, so now once a student has registered for the virtual course, how is he or she initially going to gain access to that course? After all, it is an online course, so you're not going to be able to physically guide them through the process, right? Or are you? Will you provide them with an email link for a virtual conference where they will be guided through the steps of accessing the online course via a web conferencing option? Or will you have a brief video recording that they can access, again, via an email link, right, of the process for accessing this online class? But what if they don't have an email account? Will you initially contact them via FaceTime, for example? You really need to specifically outline these procedures and be sure to include options for students with special needs or who are technologically challenged, because I guarantee you're going to be facing that. Now, I mentioned early on this virtual orientation course, and we actually had a whole segment on it. I want you to seriously consider creating a virtual orientation course for all of your virtual courses. Such a course could be the determining factor for initial student success in virtual classes. Such a course gives students the opportunity to use and familiarize themselves with the technology that they will encounter in their online courses. Be sure to check out the webinar training, Creating a Virtual Student Orientation Course for Online Success, because in this training, you will gain access to the step-by-step process on how to develop and implement your very own virtual orientation program. Now let's move on to our final target here. Downloading required software and gaining access to all accounts. Most of our adult students struggle with technology. That being said, you need to be sure that your students have access to all of the software or all of the applications that they will need for their virtual classes. Is there a mobile app for your primary or secondary LMS? For example, can they download Canvas or Zoom on their mobile phones? If so, be sure to walk them through the process. One of the greatest strengths of virtual classes is that students can access these classes from anywhere where there's internet or Wi-Fi. So when students are on the go, what better way to keep them engaged and attending your class than via phone app? Also, you have to be sure that if there's a digital book or workbook for the course, that the students have access and know how to navigate through it. If there are CAI programs you plan to incorporate as part of the course, be sure to help your students set up their accounts, gain access, and again, learn how to navigate and use these programs. Be specific in your expectations regarding regular use and access to these secondary programs and apps. Let's move to navigation, point number 5. Now, it's time to get down to the nitty-gritty as we address this course content and instructional delivery. This is the most intense navigation point because it has so many components. Now, notice that we're incorporating resources and best practices for multiple webinar trainings. They're all listed on this slide, along with the specific resources and the best practices that we're taking from each one. Now, again, if you want more detailed info, please check these out on our IPDay website. It'll help you gain a lot of clarity. Now let's continue by looking at the targets and the corresponding descriptions for this navigation point. Okay, here are the targets for this section. Let's look at each one. First, you have the scope and sequence. To develop a scope and sequence of non-mastered content for your specific online classrooms, right? Identify non-mastered contents using the student's ISPs. Mark the content on that common planning tool for the multi-level ABE classroom. Create a linear calendar or a scope and sequence of all non-mastered content just to ensure that you emphasize this content throughout the available instructional days in the trimester. Now, let's go to the syllabus, activities, and due dates. Each online course syllabus should contain the following information at a minimum. First, you gotta have instructor contact information, virtual access links, required materials, instructional framework, minimum course requirements, and a calendar with a focus on the assignments and their due dates. You gotta have an instructional framework. This should also be listed on the online course syllabus. It should include a list of the types of activities that will be incorporated into every instructional day. Now, it's possible you may have different instructional frameworks throughout the week just to avoid monotony and just keep the students interested and engaged. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Instructional strategies. Please be sure to include active learning strategies in all of the generated activities for your online classes. I'm referring specifically to the 3 active learning techniques: generate, integrate, and retrieve. And then please be sure that you include student to teacher, student to student, and student to content activities, and that you pair them up with the appropriate online tools. Now, classroom processes are critical if you are to effectively manage your online class. Here, consistency is clear and key. Establish routines and protocols for taking attendance, submitting assignments, participating in live discussions, and whatever your activity you're going to do, and just stick to them. The more you adhere to these routines, the easier it will be for you to effectively and efficiently run your online class. Now, this means you'll have more time to address, student learning and student engagement. Let's briefly address differentiating and individualizing instruction online, because honestly, it is just as important online as it is in the physical classroom. Use the student IISPs to target non-mastered content for each student. As the student masters standards or competencies, be sure to update them in their IISPs, okay? Hold regular data chats to discuss their progress. Now, since you're working in a virtual environment, you need to have these data or progress chats, right, virtually as well. So one idea is to create breakout rooms to hold one-on-one conversations with the students while the rest of the class is engaged in other instructional activities. All right, let's move to navigation point number 6. All right, number 6 addresses additional support and resources. Now, let's talk about planning resources. You need to determine what kind of resources will you provide teachers in order to plan effectively online, right? Teachers may use the student IISPs to identify non-mastered content and ensure they emphasize this content during instruction. They can use the TABE 11-12 common planning tools for that multi-level ABE classroom if their classes are multi-level. And remember, this tool aligns the TABE skills with the TABE domain across all 4 levels. So it's kind of an easy at-a-glance view of how individual skills shift in rigor and difficulty across the 4 levels. Teachers can simply highlight those skills that have not been mastered and emphasize those. Let's talk about ongoing technical support. Now, here I want to stress the word ongoing. Technology issues are a constant in a virtual setting. You'll notice I had some today, right? But here's the deal. You need to always be able to support your students, right, when they encounter these issues, especially during synchronous instruction and activities. There's so many ways of offering ongoing tech support. You just kind of have to figure out the best option for your program and your students. So I'll give you an example. Should you schedule a fixed tech support person during fixed tech support hours throughout the instructional day? Is it going to be one person or multiple people assigned to provide ongoing support? Will students be able to access tech support via breakout rooms, right? Think about these questions. Talk to your team and come up with an innovative solution that's going to satisfy the needs of your students. You also want to have ongoing academic support. You probably think, oh, this is unnecessary in a virtual setting. Oh, no. Think again. The setting doesn't change the fact that at some point in time during the course of the trimester, you will have students who will require some sort of academic intervention. So that being said, be proactive and consider setting up tutoring hours or maybe weekly reviews, and even like virtual lab hours would work. Identify CAI programs that support your classroom instruction. Now, let's go to instructional resources. There's so many instructional resources online that it's impossible to mention them all in this webinar. Feel free to explore YouTube videos, TED Talks, blogs, journal articles, web links, anything that pairs up with the content in your lessons. These additional resources can be valuable to students when they're carefully selected. For example, the OWL at Purdue is a service offered by Purdue University where students can go for like grammar and writing rules, examples, and practice activity. I use that as a reference tool all the time. Let's talk about activities resources, because this last but not least, don't forget to provide students with enrichment activities that they can do either within the scope of the required assignment or as external assignments. A good example includes project-based activities. Now, moving to number 7. This one addresses student assessment and student progress. Okay, assessment tools. When we address student assessment and progress, we have to begin by identifying how we're going to assess students in a virtual setting. These assessments should take place throughout the trimester so that teachers can continuously gauge student progress. You know, you're not limited to any particular assessment tool, but keep in mind that regardless of the online tool that you use, you must make sure that you are evaluating mastery of course content and objectives. They have to be correlated. You should be aggressively monitoring student progress towards mastery of tested content specifically, since this is how students will ultimately be assessed for the functional level promotions. Now, every student in your virtual class should have an IISP. Remember, these IISPs are live documents. With the IISPs, you and the student both have a very clear picture of the content that's going to be assessed on the post-test. These IISPs give each individual student a clear roadmap, their own roadmap toward continued progress and ultimate success. And then, of course, when you have assessments and IISPs, you got to have data chests to go hand in hand with it. So as you update the IISPs, be sure to meet with students and discuss progress made. Discuss areas where there are learning gaps, and be sure to provide clear instruction, assignments, and activities that address non-mastered content in order to help the students fill in these gaps. Now, finally, number 8, let's address course monitoring and improvement. Now, when we're talking about monitoring courses virtually, think about it. This entire training's been about creating a roadmap, right? To help you transition to learning online. So as you create this roadmap, you're going to need to address virtual course monitoring on a virtual level. Before you even begin monitoring your courses, you need to create a visitation calendar. So your initial visitation should include like a full evaluation or assessment of every online course. Now, once you've done that and you've identified the areas in need of improvement, then you can create a visitation calendar where you target these areas. Be sure to evaluate both your synchronous and your asynchronous components for these online classes. And you know, guys, please look at the delivery of instruction. Don't just look at the technology that's in place and say, well, that looks impressive, right? It has to be aligned. There has to be a purpose for the use. Look at student engagement. Are students participating in meaningful activities that address course objectives and that target learning gaps, right? Are the activities rigorous? Is active learning going on? Now, when you're gauging student progress, pay close attention to how your instructors gauge student progress or mastery of course objectives. What tools or methods are they employing in assessing students? Do all of the students have IISPs? Are they current? What is the process that these teachers have in place for updating these IISPs? Next, you're going to identify areas for improvement. You know, you can use the administrative monitoring tool that was offered when you conduct your virtual walkthroughs, right? And please stick to the visitation calendar. So that means if you're scheduled to observe a close reading activities, then stick to the plan and focus on just that. Provide your teachers with specific feedback on what you observe. Keep it positive, but stick to the plan. And now let's talk about support, instructional support. You know, part of providing instructional support includes creating a teacher action plan with each teacher, okay, with the teacher. This plan should outline areas for improvement. Teachers should be very clear that the purpose of the plan is to target these areas in order to provide them with the necessary resources and support that will lead to improvements in these areas. Now, an instructional support model of some sort should be implemented within each virtual setting. You'll need to sit with your administrative and instructional teams and outline what this support will include. And finally, be sure that you have to hold your teachers accountable. Teachers should be clear as to the expectations for improvement. Now, we have now addressed all 8 navigation points in part 2, right? And we're almost ready for that final piece. But before actually starting part 3, I kind of want to briefly recap these 8 navigation points towards transitioning online. And as I review these key points, I want to provide additional suggestions on including key school personnel with expertise in these areas, okay? The easiest way to do this is to have 8 working groups, 1 for each of these points. Some personnel may be required to participate in more than 1 group. And as always, be sure that your administrative team members are included in all 8 groups, and that at least 1 instructional expert, preferably an instructional coach or lead teacher, is included in each group as well. I always include my IT team too. Let's look at general consideration. So when you're looking at general consideration, include the following experts: your IT or tech team, so that they can address technology requirements and internet safety; your registrar to address student enrollment; and your test chair to address student assessment and placement. Some considerations for course setup, right? You should include, again, your IT tech team and instructional coach, right? And they will help determine the best course location, course modality components, and the instructional platform. Your registrar and instructional coach, and even some clerical personnel, can provide valuable input as you develop your communication plan. Now, when developing course components, be sure your IT team works closely with your instructional coach to identify essential synchronous and asynchronous components for the course, right? And your IT team will also play a key part in setting up a standardized template for all of your online courses so that there is consistency throughout your program. They can also assist in setting up additional online accounts and documenting the process for setting up these accounts and gaining access. And that's for both the teachers and the students. Finally, your instructional coach should work closely with selected instructors to establish a school-wide concurrent communication plan. This concurrent plan is so critical in establishing teacher presence in an online course as much as it is in creating a positive course culture. It should provide for multiple ways in which instructors and students can continuously communicate with each other via various means, such as, WhatsApp or FaceTime or course chat, social media, and other synchronous options. As we address providing course access, right, you want to be sure to include your registrar, because your registrar is essential in this process. You may also want to include a school site counselor if available. Your IT team can facilitate the downloading of required software as much as help create that cheat note that we talked about earlier for students on how to create and access the various accounts they'll be using. And finally, if you do decide to create a virtual student orientation course, which again, I strongly recommend, you will need to have 1 representative for each of these areas mentioned here, right? And since the course is supposed to mirror the actual online course as much as possible, it's critical that all the interested parties be involved in developing the content and the procedures for this course. So please don't leave anybody out. So course content and instructional delivery should be addressed by experts in this area. So it should include your instructional coach along with your best teachers. But you may also want to include your IT team, because they can provide valuable information regarding which platform tools would be the best options for, activity A or activity B. Very valuable info. Now, who will provide additional support and resources? And number 6. Well, again, your instructional coach and your best teachers are key here. Your IT team can also help to determine how technical support will be provided to both teachers and students. When it comes to assessment and monitoring student progress, be sure to include, right, your instructional coach and your test chair, and maybe some key selected instructors to provide input on how students are going to be assessed throughout the trimester. You should also identify multiple methods of assessment, and just be sure to include how you will incorporate the use of these IISPs in the process, because the IISPs are critical for ongoing progress monitoring. Course monitoring and improvement. At number 8, you're going to sit with your instructional coach, right? And identify who is going to support each teacher throughout the trimester. If you have a data person at your school, awesome. Include this person because they can help you to identify the best ways for moving your student performance data. All right, so now we definitely ended part 2. We had a nice little summary, and we're going to continue with part 3, where we are going to look at some ways in which you can establish a strong teacher presence online. This is actually my favorite part. Okay. According to Pearson's white paper, it's titled Teaching Presence. The research suggests that building a strong sense of connectedness in an online course promotes student success, engages students, and retains students. Now, this requires that you establish a strong teaching presence within the course and that you create structure for students to form a community. Now, unlike face-to-face teaching that depends on physical presence and teacher immediacy, teaching presence in online education depends on course design and organization, depends on facilitation of online discourse, and it also depends on a well-focused direct instruction. Now, in the teaching presence white paper mentioned before, there are 3 important elements of teaching presence that are corroborated by surveys of experienced online students and teachers. Now, these elements include the 3 that I just mentioned: course design or organization, facilitating discourse, and direct instruction. Now, you're probably wondering at this point, what does course design have to do with establishing a strong teaching presence? Let's look at some interesting statistics first. So, face-to-face teaching depends on physical presence, but that's obviously not the case with online instruction. To establish teacher presence in a virtual setting, you need to emphasize course design and organization. You need to emphasize facilitation of online discourse and well-focused direct instruction. Let's look at some stats from the blog page titled Course Design as Teaching Presence in Online Courses. We begin with the response of students who were actually successful in their online course on the left. Now, these students rank facilitation of discourse and direct instruction as equally important, with instructional design and organization way far behind. When we look at the responses from students who were not successful, on the right, we see that they identified course instructional design and organization as a more likely cause than other factors. Interesting. Now, we're going to begin with course design. So your students first get a sense of your teaching presence through the design of your online materials. So think about it. For an online learning environment, you need to shift from preparing class sessions, right, to preparing learning modules with specific learning goals, reading assignments, instructional materials, learning activities, discussion posts, assessments procedures, and so much more. So as you design your course, ask yourself these 3 questions. What do I want students to learn in this module? How will students demonstrate learning? And what assignments or activities will support learning of content in the module? Now, you're going to see 3 simple checklists. Here's the first. This checklist will help you optimize course design. I'm not going to read you any of the checklists. I just want to share them with you. They have been adapted from the Teaching Presence white paper from Pearson, and you'll be able to go through them and use them as you go through your course design. Now, let's move to facilitating online discourse. There's some specific examples from Pearson on how you can do just that, and I love these. These are great examples, so easy. When you're identifying areas of agreement or disagreement, just say, hey, Joe, Mary has provided a compelling counterexample to your hypothesis. Would you care to respond? If you're seeking to reach consensus, you might want to say, I think Joe and Mary are saying essentially the same thing. What about encouraging students and acknowledging them? Thank you for your insightful comments. To set a positive climate. Don't feel self-conscious about thinking out loud on the forum. This is a place to try out new ideas after all. To get your students to participate. Any thoughts on this issue? Anyone care to comment? To assess the lesson and maybe rein them in if they get off track. I think we're getting a little off track here. So simple phrases. Now, here's the second checklist. Check it out on your own. You have a full copy in the companion resource handbook. All right, we're going to end this section with direct instruction. And this is when students are able to witness your disciplinary expertise through your online interaction with it. Now, according to the article titled Establishing an Online Teaching Presence from Duquesne University, indicators of direct instruction include presenting content and questions, focusing the discussion on specific issues, summarizing discussion, confirming understanding, disposing misperceptions, injecting knowledge from diverse sources, and responding to technical concerns. Well, that is a mouthful. Now, look at this quote. Direct instruction is about academic and pedagogic leadership. That is, educational leadership that provides disciplinary focus and structure or scaffolding, but also offers choice and opportunity for students to assume responsibility for their learning. This instruction is more than a guide on the side, but less than a sage on the stage. It is an approach whereby learning is socially shared. This is the path to a meaningful, systematic, and worthwhile educational experience. Now, look at the three components listed above for direct instruction. Do these look familiar? In essence, you can think of the three components in terms of the gradual release of responsibility for active learning model. See it? First comes the I do. So this addresses the presentation of new material. Since we're talking about an online format, be sure to carefully select your material. Make sure it's divided into manageable size modules that students can easily digest. Use your synchronous tools to demonstrate, to solve, and help students make connections. Use think aloud strategies during your virtual presentation so that students are able to hear your thought process as you analyze or you tackle difficult concepts. This will enable them to correctly apply new information and procedures to a given situation. It's just a great opportunity to establish clear learning goals for your students. Next, you must effectively guide the learning process. It's more the we do. And the key here is frequent feedback. So remember, guiding the learning process online is much more difficult than face-to-face. So it requires a lot more effort on your part. Be sure to provide explicit corrective feedback on a frequent and ongoing basis. Check in with students every week and give them an opportunity to ask questions and receive clarification. And finally, we have the you do part of gradual release. And this can be done in two forms. You can either have the students work together as a group and complete an activity, or each student can complete an activity independently. For complicated activities, or if you're working with students who are language shy, group activities obviously work best. Now, let's look at the third and last checklist, right? That addresses direct instruction. As before, I'm not going to read it out loud. Just refer to it in the companion resource handbook. And now we are ready to move on to the last part of our training. So as we look at this last part, part 4, we're going to take a look at how we can effectively use technology in order to transform face-to-face instruction and activities to online learning. Transform is the key word. You know, there is no question that technology is changing and continues to change the way we teach. That being said, I ask you, what is the difference between converting your course content for online learning and transforming course content for online learning? Look at this visual. When you convert course content, you're simply like digitizing the content, so you can just access it online. When you transform content and activities, you actually consider the best technical tools available on your platform, and then you use these tools to drive these activities. Now, in this example, you're converting, let's say, a traditional essay assignment, right? By simply having the students type it up and then submit it as an attachment. Not a good example. Look at the second one. The ultimate goal for the writing assignment is still the same. You still want the students to make a thematic connection about a text. However, the activity lends itself very well to the virtual forum. Students can select a series of pictures that correlates to their analysis of the text. Then they share their pictures with the class via live conferencing by sharing their screens. As they present their photo essays, they explain how the photos relate to the text, what they reveal about the text, and why this matters, which is thematic connection. Here, the assignment makes use of the online tools available on the LMS. So what originally seems like a regular and not very exciting writing activity, right, has just been transformed into an engaging activity with visuals. By the way, I tried this myself. I loved it. The students loved it. All right, in part 3, okay, we did take a look at an in-depth look at establishing teacher presence, right? And now I just want to expand a little bit on teacher presence by focusing on the use of technology in transforming face-to-face to online. Establishing a meaningful instructor presence through the effective use of technology, right, is a very powerful strategy for enhancing student outcomes. You know, students can easily distinguish when technology is integrated into an online course with a clear purpose from when it appears to serve no purpose at all. It's critical for teachers to clearly communicate to students when and how to use technology-based resources. And let's just look at a few ways to accomplish this. So let's address live chats, discussion boards, and polls, because these are common ones, right? When it comes to live chats, just do it weekly. You know, it's a great way to get to know your students and to be open and provide them with opportunities for them to get to know you, right? Schedule some chat times and be kind of flexible in your schedule so that all your students have an opportunity to participate. You may even want to make a minimum number of chat sessions mandatory just to increase participation. Now, when posting to discussion boards, provide a clear rubric. This will make the interaction more meaningful. And then polls are an easy way to gauge your audience. Always a good follow-up. Now, as we conclude, you know that I'm going to want to reflect a little bit. So let's look at these 4 words. I want you to change the way you think about transitioning from face-to-face learning to learning online. I want you to familiarize yourself with the content that we shared today to create your own roadmap to making the transition. Redesign your current transition plan for online learning, right? Use online specific if-they resources that are going to best fit the goals of your program. Review the information that we provided in this training. Share this 8-step roadmap with your teachers and other administrators and district personnel, and become an expert on best practices for transitioning from face-to-face to online. Reflect and make a change, and ask yourself, what is working in a face-to-face classroom, and how can I transform this content rather than convert it to online? Okay, so I think it's been a rather long webinar today. We are down to the wire. So I just want to thank you all for participating in today's webinar training. And at this time, I am going to pass the baton over to June so that she can walk you through the evaluation process and get some feedback from you.
Maria, thank you so much. The feedback slide is now on your screen. If you would just take a minute to take the poll, we would appreciate it. And while you're doing that, I just want to remind you that our next webinar will be next Wednesday, May 12th. The title of the webinar will be Moving IET Awareness for Beginners to Contextualize Application in Any Program. So I hope to see all of you next Wednesday. And until then, thank you so much.